during.
We forgot to hit record.
So
So we're still getting the hang of this. Sorry to interrupt.
but I think their involvement and the opportunity for them to voice an opinion is really key. So I think we should have some vehicle.
Agreed. I agree. I do have a comment on when the public input should be. If it's at the beginning, whoever's commenting hasn't heard what we're talking about yet. If it's at the very end, though, they have heard what we're talking about, but it's, there's no opportunity for us to digest and potentially make action items to follow up. There's a really killer point. So I'd say somewhere near the end, but not at the end. And then if there's something we would like to have a little bit further, more discussion about what somebody said, we actually have a little bit, maybe not hours at the end, but time at the end to do that.
If we took that approach, would it make sense then at the subsequent meeting to address that at the beginning of the meeting, or save that for the end as well?
Well, the meetings are gonna be they're not gonna be every week. So if we're only doing it every, few months or whatever, then
Forget, you lose momentum.
because there's so much work that happens in those intervening months that I think it would be good to sort of at least address things that we want to address in a timely way at the end of the meeting.
Do you have a sense, Bill, how long each meeting will be? Is there a desire to hold things to 2 hours? That's usually a good round number. You think that'll be possible, or is it just hard to say?
I think the feedback is from this group is helpful. Like if we want to, as a group, try to limit it to 2 hours, and then maybe there's some kind of vote to extend if we're in the middle of something that.
Well, yeah, I don't know if we want to be rigid about it.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking if we say, okay, we're gonna have our discussion, talk about what we should do, review, and then maybe have some public input, and then perhaps take a 5-minute break, and then come back, redigest, and discuss for another 10 or 15.
Does it, since this is gonna be a working group, is there gonna be times where there's more for us to do and we might need a longer meeting?
Yeah,
So we
I don't think we
may
can
know
say.
ahead of time that, okay, we're actually gonna plan for 2.5 hours for this meeting because we got a lot of work to do. So
That makes sense. So maybe in the next agenda, we can try to think about the public involvement and where to sequence that into the agenda and then see how it works.
Could we put in the agenda too that the public could talk so that people then feel like they can come and
Yeah.
talk if they want?
And if, I guess it's what, we're asking, if someone's coming to talk, it's not we'll wait for you at the end of the meeting. Is it we're actually they're joining us in the problem solving conversation, in which case it would happen at every agenda item versus a beginning or an end. Like there's almost an empty chair at the table that's called the public. And anyone from the public could come and sit at that chair, and that's actually physical or virtual, but something, if we're saying we value the community to come and join this conversation wherever they're at, like how open are our arms
Yeah,
in that joint? It felt like there was a lot of openness, but
I'm curious. Yeah, I felt like there was a lot of openness. We had 12 applicants, but by that large. That's tricky because you don't want someone to come in and hijack.
well, that's the question is like, we're an advisory committee, we're not voting on policy, and so this becomes an official record of the community conversation that goes up to the decision makers. I don't feel comfortable saying, sorry, you're not part of this club because we're the only 30 people that made it to the meeting. That said, I don't know that someone who just shows up and has missed 6 previous meetings and will miss the next 6 next meetings has a seat. And maybe we can play it by ear. Do we do it?
Sorry. I think it's important to remember that this is the starting point, and as this develops and we make our recommendations, that the public can weigh in at any time with planning commission or with city council, and inevitably that's where it's going to have to happen. It doesn't matter what opinion any of us have individually. It's a collective process. I'm happy to listen, and everyone here is happy to listen. It happens at the grocery store, it happens at community restaurant, and happy to reflect that and represent that. And but we have a long way to go.
Is, they're gonna be on that Lafayette Listens page, like a forum for people to write in their comments and stuff?
Yeah, I just made actually a note, so the page will have different opportunities for folks to engage and provide their thoughts, and I think maybe as part of the packet, we should just include everything we've gotten in the in-between period. That would be probably helpful. So you don't have to fish it out of the site yourself.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Okay. So, like, we could, there's a couple of good ideas. We could have something just formal towards the end of the meeting, but I would like to suggest that Michelle's suggestion is that there might be times when there's people in the audience and they're here and it might be beneficial to weigh in or allow them to weigh in in the moment if the group wants to open it up for that. And so maybe not be so rigid as to say this is the only time, but there might be times where we know some folks might be interested in participating, and it could be valuable for the chair to solicit that as part of the group dynamic. So maybe not.
We could just say, we could just preface it by, we would encourage you to, consult our working group charter and the dynamics of our group and respect everyone's time and
Yeah.
not hijack. meeting.
Yeah, and if there's like a room full of people, obviously that's not gonna be
That's
an
not
appropriate
what it
thing,
is.
so.
I think that the chair should have the ability to bring a discussion to a close. Okay, because there are occasions when you confront there is no horse too dead to beat phenomenon. And I think the chair needs to have the authority to say, let's bring this to a close.
That makes sense.
Okay, so we're gonna feel out the next one, we'll add a point for community input, and we can do that tonight at a certain point as well too. We have some attendance.
Shall we put the rest of the other questions that we have?
It was really if you had any input around the charter overall, so if there's any portions of
Any other
that.
comments on them?
No.
One point of order question for those that are attending virtually, are they expected to raise their hand or just jump in?
Yeah, Bob, if you would like to comment on any of this, you can certainly raise your hand and we'll see it on our end. I think we're working through some technical pieces right now, but.
Good. I know how to use raising my hand, and I will do so rather than just jump in.
Perfect. Good, Chair. I think that
All right.
concludes the next item.
So now we will hear from, we'll have a brief presentation on the project from Nolan. Could you please pronounce your full name? Nolan Nusay. No, just say it.
Yeah, my last name is pronounced Nick Hayes.
Yes, thank you.
And Nolan, are you able to share your screen to the slide deck?
I believe I can. Yeah, let me test that out here.
And there's some issues with the camera malfunctioning when we record it for some reason, and so I think we're calling it a pilot, so we'll continue calling it a pilot through this meeting.
Now, are you able to see my PowerPoint presentation?
No.
No.
Okay.
Are you sharing right now?
Cameras.
Okay, Nolan, can you try?
Are you
now,
able to
please?
able to
there.
share it now or able to see it now?
Yep.
Okay, well,
Thanks.
I have to exit full screen mode here. Can you see it still or no?
Yep, we see everything. So.
Okay, let me try to maximize this view here. Because
Your
otherwise
full
it takes
screen
up my
is
whole
working.
screen and then I can't.
Nolan, yeah, you can hit F5 and just go to full screen.
Okay, but then I need to be able to see you and I need to be able to see my notes, so I don't really want it to go full screen. Sorry about
So
this.
we'll have some notes for IT. So thanks for everyone's patience.
Sorry about this. Let me see if I can go into a let me stop sharing here. I'm sorry about this. I'm trying to make sure that I can see you and also my notes at the same time. And otherwise it's taking over the full screen.
Be able to show one window.
You have to share, go into presentation view, and then hit escape, so that you leave presentation as part of the two screen view, so you're only looking at the presentation. It's.
Or kiosk mode or something.
Exactly. 17 clicks later, you might get it.
Let's see.
Office wants you to use Teams.
Just one moment, please. I'm sorry about this. We'll just call this a 3-minute break.
Anybody have a good joke? That's not a 3-minute joke, right? I don't have any good jokes. My bad ones. There's gotta be some dads in here.
I know, I'm just thinking.
I'm like, there's too
trying
many
to
dads
dig
in here,
into-
I don't have a dad joke ready to go. Somebody's got one. See too many smiles. Can't remember a joke, what?
Never remember when we would never come.
Mushroom walks into a bar. Bartender says, sorry, we don't serve you here. Mushroom says, why not? I'm a fun guy.
Oh, Bob.
Yeah. How does the Easter Bunny keep his coat so so clean and neat?
How?
He uses his hairbrush.
Man,
It's a bad granddad joke.
We're here for
safe space.
Okay, think this is gonna work. Let's try it out here. Share screen. Okay, let's see if you'll be able to see this. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Woo! You, okay. Thank goodness. I'm sorry about that. I just was anyway, let's move on. So again, my name is Nolan Nikis. I'm here with the company ZoneCo. We are a consultant that we work specifically on zoning codes with cities across the United States. And I'm happy to be here with you. It's great that there are so many people that are excited about being involved in this process. It's not always the most entertaining process, but it's a very important one. So thanks for your involvement in your community and your service to your city. For agenda item number 4, we're going to talk about the land use code project overview. First, we'll talk about land use codes in general. Next, we'll look at the goals of this project and the timeline for it. And lastly, we'll ask to see if you have any questions or comments. So I'm going to introduce some types of land use codes in general. We'll be briefly discussing conventional land use codes. These are oftentimes referred to as Euclidean codes. The reason I'm calling them conventional does not mean that we have to follow it. I'm calling it conventional because these are used by the majority of cities across the country. The next type of code we'll talk about is a form-based code. And lastly, we'll talk about a hybrid. So for a conventional code, basic standards are applied. And what I mean by that is we're going to focus mostly on uses. And then we will apply other standards such as setbacks, height limits, etc., that do relate to form, but the major categorical element is use. And a lot of times these codes get very detailed in the types of uses that they regulate. So for example, sometimes you may see something as specific as antique store. It wouldn't necessarily just be a store, it's an antique store. So highly specific uses. And some of those could add design guidelines, and this would make it more of a hybrid type code.
Nolan, if I might add something to the conventional codes that we had talked about is, like, the conventional codes regulate, like, ones that based on use, but general standards like height, setbacks, lot coverage, FAR, floor area ratio. But these things can manifest themselves in hundreds of different ways. So you can apply the same standards to the same piece of property and not be certain on the outcome of that, which is, you know, Lafayette has a conventional code today, which is why we have a really involved public process, because a grocery store can manifest itself in 100 different ways on the same piece of property, and the codes aren't specific enough to have intentional outcomes. And so they often cater to like the whims of the developer, and not necessarily to the needs of the community, unless the community adds layers and layers and layers of other regulations on, like, so Nolan talked about design standards or design guidelines to help guide it down a certain path. But the conventional codes, one of the issues with it is that it is so broad in what it could allow. A community cannot be certain of the outcome until they actually see a proposal in front of them. Even though that proposal might meet all the standards, it might not be something that the community really desires at the end of the day.
So that raises a question for me, Jeff. I spent decades working federal government acquisition program. And part of the problem was they would issue an RFP that was an attempt to design the end product through the RFP. And are we talking about designing construction 20 years from now through the code? Or are we going to have something that's broader than that? Because I'm very reluctant to try to design something that's going to be around in 2050.
Yeah.
Or be developed in 2050.
Great question, and let's put that to be talked about when we go through the rest of this stuff. It's a great question, guy.
Nolan, are you ready?
Oh, yep, I'm resharing here, I'm sorry. I do not know what's happening because this was not a slide that I had in my presentation. Okay, well, anyway, on to form-based codes, I'm sorry. So a form-based code focuses more heavily on urban design and the relationship between the building and the street, the building and another building, the building with the users, and with parking. Form-based codes still regulate uses, but typically they're going to be more general in their use categories. They do focus less on the uses than the conventional codes, and they focus more heavily on building types and frontage types, which form a community that embraces the character that we seek. Both of these images may be red on a zoning map, meaning commercial, but of course they have very different characters and experiences for the users. I love this juxtaposition. It's really quite powerful. So form-based codes have some use regulations again, but they're generally more categorical rather than specific. So instead of antique store, you may just see retail, for instance. They also focus more on form, which has the effect of addressing the public realm and the public's interaction with a building. And because of this, there may be more complex administration, such as reviewing building and architectural plans during the approval process. Lastly, I'll talk about hybrid codes. Now, a lot of you may know that most newer codes combine elements of conventional use-based codes and form-based codes, as well as some performance-based standards. I'm going to talk about one code. This is a code in Covington, Kentucky. It's actually where I'm calling from today. And my colleague was instrumental in getting this code produced and adopted. Actually, at the time that he was working on this, I was working for the county and had a role in reviewing and providing comments to the Planning Commission regarding this code. This code, as you may or may not be able to see, depending on the size of the projector there, includes building types, frontage types, as well as use categories. The Covington Code also includes many tables and is tech savvy in that those tables include hyperlinks to other important and applicable sections to make it easier to use for somebody who is looking at this on the computer. As you may also be able to see, this Covington Code uses a lot of illustrations and graphics. We see these as very important in aiding the ease of use of this document. We know that all of these documents are part of a democratic form of government, ruled by the people for the people. And so our documents have to be able to be accessed by the people and for the people as well. So hybrid codes, there's a mix of approaches that we may be able to accomplish that optimal mix of use regulations, predictable public realm interactions, and a decreased burden on administration. Next, I will talk about the team here. So for this project, the City of Lafayette hired ZoneCo along with our project partners. Again, ZoneCo focuses specifically on zoning ordinance rewrites. Typically, we come into projects after a comprehensive plan has been produced and adopted. So Lafayette, of course, has Legacy Lafayette, which was recently adopted. So this is perfect timing to come in and start implementing a comprehensive plan. We are partnered with 3 partners, so it's a big team here. That includes Yarden Company, which has incredible resources when it comes to public engagement. SWBR, which their staff there that's working on this project is very experienced in charrettes and also has people on staff there related to architecture and engineering, so brings those resources as well. And we partnered with Cushing Terrell. Cushing Terrell, our partner there is out of their Denver office and allows us to have staff in the city of Lafayette on a short notice or for some events where we may want somebody to be there in person presenting. Of course, there's always back and forth with the city of Lafayette. And when I say the city of Lafayette, I mean their staff that is there today, Phil and Jeff, as well as you. You are representatives now on this process of your respective groups. And our interaction with you is included in that interaction with the city of Lafayette. So thank you again for being part of this process and part of this team. Next, we'll talk about the goals and timeline of this project. The ultimate goal of this project is to rewrite the land use code to reflect the policies and strategies detailed in Legacy Lafayette. This is, of course, an implementation portion of the greater comprehensive plan process. While there is one main goal, there are many other goals for this project. For instance, we will be creating a document that is clear, equitable, defensible, and easy to use. We must also adequately engage the public in the process. We're not trying to do this behind closed doors. We're not trying to make somebody feel like we were pulling one over on them. So the public needs to be engaged. This is a democratic process. And we must respect the ideals of inclusion, diversity, and eclecticness. Along the process, we must continue to ask ourselves, are we accomplishing these goals? And if not, what can we do to better accomplish those goals? One of the goals too is, of course, to accomplish this project in a reasonable amount of time. We don't want to rush the process if that means sacrificing quality, but we also don't want this to be a 3-year process that exhausts the community, exhausts the staff, and exhausts you, the working group. No code is going to be perfect when it's adopted, but we will try to get the code as ideal as possible within the amount of time that is reasonable. So let's go through the general timeline for this project. Currently, we are in early to mid 2023. I have engagement in mid 2023. The engagement portion of this process is of course important, but we are having conversations with the staff about when the most opportune time to have that engagement is. But while we're having those conversations, we are working through the calibration portion of this project, which I'll get into more detail later. And once the calibration is finalized, that moves us right into drafting the code. Hopefully we have that finalized draft in early 2024, and it's prepared to be adopted in mid 2024. This slide is a detailed view of the project process. I don't know if you'll be able to read all of it, but hopefully you can. You can trust that we have used this general process with dozens of other cities across the United States, and we are confident that this process will lead you through the journey in a strategic and logical manner. In short, we have kicked off the project, and later in this meeting, I will present on the diagnostic report. That's 1B. After the diagnostic report, and in the last month, we have been working through looking at generating a draft map, draft table of contents, and draft calibration table. The calibration table, which outlines each of the proposed districts and their proposed standards, leads into the working group and perhaps the public feedback, which will then lead right into the codification phase, which is where we are drafting the code language. Lastly, of course, the code is nothing without it being adopted. And so the adoption phase will follow that. Sometimes the adoption phase can last a while. However, I'm confident that with the working group that we have here, I know that a lot of you are representatives of the Planning Commission. And so hopefully any of the kinks that the Planning Commission would see during that adoption phase have already been addressed during this codification phase.
Can I make one comment, Nolan? And that's the kind of the phases of deliverables that we'll be looking at. And so there'll be kind of the sausage making deliverable, and that's going to be some Word documents and tables and things like that. And then once those are in a place where we're all comfortable with, it's at that point where we'll transfer it to a more aesthetically kind of pleasing format using probably Adobe InDesign. So the more graphic design kind of look and feel. And so there'll be a lot of that working in those kinds of those styles, and then we'll bring it into the document afterward.
Thank you, Phil. That's a really good point. So my preference in drafting this is to draft this in Microsoft Word, and then, as Phil said, bring it into Adobe InDesign in a formatted, user-friendly yet beautiful format towards the end. And the reason behind that is that it's always easier to bring things into InDesign towards the end rather than exporting it InDesign into Microsoft Word, as I've had experience with. And for members of the public and members of the working group, looking at a document in Microsoft Word is a lot more accessible. There are very few people out there that have InDesign licenses. And so it's going to be a lot easier for people to look at and provide comments on a Microsoft Word document, and then bring it into InDesign at a later point. Yeah, thank you, Phil. Okay, are there any questions about the different types of codes, whether those are conventional, form-based or hybrid? Are there any questions about the project team, the general process, and the goals?
Might add just one thing, we sent out some videos on, that you may have had an opportunity to take a look at. In some previous conversations we have had with the planning commission and council, we've talked a bit about the questions of why did we get to a hybrid code? So the thinking behind that was the comp plan has a real emphasis on design outcomes. And so there's opportunities, particularly in new neighborhoods, in commercial corridors and other places where the form-based code might naturally lend itself to those. But there's also the question of existing neighborhoods. And so many of our neighborhoods are built, they've built fairly recently, in many cases. And so the full form-based code may not be needed there. It may be more of the traditional style. And so we might just see what works the best for which geography and context.
While we're working through this process, development doesn't stop. So how are you going to enable some of the beautiful ideas of form-based and hybrid when you have conventional use?
A really good question.
Yeah.
Annexations are probably the big opportunity we have to influence the outcome towards the direction of where the code's going.
Yeah, well, so the beauty and not, and Guy, I want to get back to your question too. The beauty and where our code is not beautiful as well, forces things into a PUD process, plan unit development process, which is kind of, it's customized zoning for projects. And so right now, there are certain things that we can implement through the PUD because there's a basis in the comprehensive plan for those outcomes. And even though the timing is not ideal, the comprehensive plan is an important review criteria for PUDs, and we're able to do that. The problem with that though is that we're doing it outside of any consistency and we're relying on a lot of skill sets on the staff level and with the developers teams. So sometimes you get really good teams, sometimes you don't get good teams. So we do have a little bit of flexibility within the current process. There are also tie-ins to growth management. So most of you might be aware we have a growth management regulation in place. And that only allows 1,200 permits in a 6-year cycle, or 1,200 dwelling units in a 6-year cycle to be permitted. And we're pretty much towards the end of that. And so we've been directing people that want to develop newer residential neighborhoods that there's not allocations necessarily available, which kind of puts a pause on some of those discussions as well. But if they are able to qualify for exemption, there's exemptions on affordability and some other stuff. Again, we use the PUD process to help try to shape the outcomes of that. So it's not ideal. There might be a point in time where we can phase in certain aspects of this code as they become more fully developed. And that is a lot of times some communities do that, like they'll implement the new landscaping code ahead of time, or lighting standards or sign code or something like that. And we can take that approach when we get towards the end of the project, because adopting is not just adopting the document, also mapping it. And when you map it, there's a completely different type of outreach you have to do with the community, because you're actually, in some instances, changing property rights. And so how we map it might be phased out over time. So it's important to be able to get more modern standards adopted while we map it, so we can get the benefit of the new code under both zoning stuff. So there's a lot of art to this, but that's kind of like how staff is approaching this stuff.
You mentioned the 1,200 residential units. How is all of this going to be impacted by our illustrious governor's one-size-fits-all rezoning Colorado plan?
Yeah, well, we won't know unless it's passed. That's one thing. But if it's passed, we're actually in a good position to respond to it because we're already doing the work. We're engaged with the work, we're doing the work. And one of the aspects of this proposal is that cities can create their own version of what they're presenting in the land use bill. So we can tailor it to our community. It doesn't mean that we're gonna be happy with everything we have to do, but we're doing a lot. There's a lot in that bill that's already contemplated by this project, like ADU expansions, parking. I wouldn't say parking exemptions yet, but looking at how we regulate parking and mandate parking. Definitions of family and how that relates to housing choice. Housing choice is a big part of the comp plan, as you're aware. So we'll be able to shape that a little bit more proactively because we're already engaged in this process.
Well, you know, part of that is, as Bob mentioned when he introduced himself, is constraints on residential construction is one of the things that's driving housing costs in Colorado.
Mhm.
And that's what the governor says that he's interested in addressing.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, it seems to me that a growth constraint is running head on into what the state is talking about doing.
Yeah, potentially, yes. You have one other question that I want to make sure we understand and that we can talk about. Are we going to regulate how we're building in 50 years? Can you rephrase your question?
I'm trying to recall.
It was, you said, I don't want to design things for 2050. I don't want to.
You know, I believe that we would need to have a lot of discussion. I don't particularly care for over-specific mandates. Because I had a discussion in this very room several months ago, possibly a couple of years ago, about electric EV chargers in residences. Okay, we don't know what the connection for this is gonna be in 2 years, much less what the connection to an EV is gonna be. And so I'm concerned about over specifying and then finding ourselves overtaken by technology.
It's fair point.
You know, I mean, I'm reluctant to see us try to design an outcome through the code.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why we're here though, right? So it's important that our zoning documents are living documents and that they're updated regularly. The fact that it's taken 40 some years to update the existing code is a problem, right? And so we update our comprehensive plans regularly and we update the codes regularly. And one of the objectives that we put in the RFP for this project is that it's got to be organized in a way that we can plug and play concepts as those concepts evolve and change over time. But to your point, your broader point is,
The private sector moves really fast on stuff.
yeah,
And even they're talking now about printing buildings.
yeah.
Doing the printing buildings.
And that's why we have to update building codes on a 3-year basis instead of a 40-year basis. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I would add that
Go ahead.
zone, oh yeah, thank you. That the idea of having a zoning code in part is there to provide stability, right? Or predictability. Of course, if we had no zoning code and somebody could do or build whatever they pleased on their private land, which would be the ultimate freedom, right? We wouldn't have that predictability. So part of why they exist is to provide predictability. But we also, of course, like you were saying, we don't know what's going to come in 5 years, let alone 50. So we need to create a code that is updatable, but also one that is flexible enough to consider technologies, building materials, or trends that we're not even familiar with yet because we have no way of knowing about them. For example, I work in with a lot of older codes that still refer to tanneries. I have never come across a tannery in my days. And so there are some old uses listed. Maybe a better, more flexible approach would be to have a use that is manufacturing or heavy processing, for example. That is broad, not knowing what our industry is going to look like in the future, but categorizing things based on their impacts to their surrounding areas. So we pay a lot of attention to that, creating that flexibility, but also the predictability at the same time. So it's the balance that is our challenge.
The form-based code does offer an opportunity to get a bit more predictability with how our blocks laid out in larger areas. What does it look like between the curb and the property line? And then our buildings further away from the street with parking in front, or is that vice versa, where parking is tucked behind? So those kinds of things. And then the use inside the building is a little bit more permissive, and we're less concerned about that because the trade-off is we've gotten a little bit more predictability on the design and the main, and with a heavy emphasis on the public realm. And so it does allow for some more adaptability with those uses in the building over time.
Other questions?
Do we expect to rush on development opportunities ahead of this effort because what we have now is known versus what may come out as unknown?
Yeah, it happens, yes, but like, again, that's part of the adoption strategy. There are ways to kind of look at that and address it. And so when we get to that point, we'll need to talk about that. Absolutely. Every time you change, to Guy's point, private industry does move fast, but they also rely on known quantities, and when those known quantities change, it messes with their performance, and they really like to come in and take advantage of the predictability that used to be there where it changes. So yeah, it's an important consideration.
Yeah, when we work with cities, sometimes they come into these processes with a particular use that they're concerned about, and that, you know, through this process, they're going to want to regulate in a different way. And that could induce people to, you know, start those businesses before this process is too far along. I don't think that that's what I've been seeing in Lafayette. I haven't heard that you have a particular land use that you're really concerned about and looking to regulate in a totally different manner. So I don't foresee that, but if there is that case, there are a couple of strategies we can use to address that.
I'm curious about the timeline for the potential statewide legislation, and what city council is doing or not doing regarding that.
City council, we discussed it at the last meeting, and they directed staff to write a letter of opposition. And it's already been drafted and signed and sent off to the legislature. So, yeah.
When does that go and be voted on?
We don't know. It's in committee at the moment, so.
Can you just enlighten me as to what the opposition was?
Yeah, I think the way we talk to council about it is, in the way that council kind of verbalized it as well, is, you know, there are many things that the city is already leading on with this project, with our comp plan that we just adopted. And a fatal flaw is that if passed, it would take away our ability to have these conversations with the community and to make the right decisions for Lafayette. And so unintentionally, they're inhibiting us doing something that we already want to do on our own terms. And that was a fundamental flaw that council thought was a bridge too far on this. So
Doesn't that violate the home rule?
and that's an extension of that, yeah. Protecting home rule is also important for council. Absolutely. Yeah.
If the Denver Post was accurate in their reporting, okay, the idea is to pass this coding legislation for all of Colorado and then let individual municipalities deal with it on their own. Well, basically, it's what we're doing now, except we have more freedom to do it. You know, and
Yeah.
the Council of Mayors in Colorado opposed the legislation.
The key element of the bill as it was written was that no one is going to impede the building of middle housing. It's up to 6 units, and that's specific, and it doesn't matter what the city wants to do in its own universe or following the template the state produces. It's debilitating. It's
There also
Yeah.
weren't any cost constraints.
Correct.
There was nothing saying you have to have units that are affordable, attainable, just more.
it
And
turns,
there's no,
it turns the rulemaking, this,
That would be in the,
This-
it's the city's code. If you're gonna build that 6-unit thing in Lakewood or Littleton, you would have to adopt the code.
There's one carve out though, and it's very vague, Bill, is that if you can have that, it's called inclusionary housing, where a certain number of units need to be affordable. But the bill says if it makes it financially feasible to the applicant, then you can no longer apply that. And so,
Which
yeah,
is
there's some of those, you
Which
kind of
says
dig
that.
in, you find a lot of those things in the bill.
I mean, like this middle housing, and Bill has a book on middle housing, that's quite good. It's something that we want to talk about. in our-
pass it around.
Yeah, it's something we want to talk about and engage this group on new neighborhoods. Like, the comprehensive plan talks about new neighborhoods should offer a variety of housing for different price points, for different types of people, and needs. And like, is a 6-plex the right thing? Or is it a 4-plex? We're gonna engage you all on like, and one of the foundations of the bill is that you can't make it more onerous than a single family detached. So if we allow in our neighborhoods, a 3,000 square foot single family home within a certain envelope, why can't that be a duplex? Why can't that be a triplex? Why can't that be a quadplex or something like that? But it's still a 3,000 square foot structure. It just happens to have a couple households living in it, but it's something that we define and it fits right next to the single family dwelling, or it fits right next to a stacked unit or something like that. But it looks and it feels like our neighborhoods. Take that to Old Town as well, right? Old Town has its own unique character. And there's actually form-based coding and aspects of our Old Town zoning. If we decide that this is the envelope for Old Town, can you fit a 6-plex in there or not within that envelope? Because Old Town is, the housing is much more modest in size and scale. And if the answer is no, but we're being forced to do that, what does that mean to Old Town? So those are the types of conversations we need to have, because it's ultimately about character. It's ultimately about accommodating different family types and needs. But we have water resource needs, we have infrastructure needs. Where's the transportation funding around all of this stuff? And so the bill is just way too broad as it's currently defined, and it takes away our ability to have these conversations.
It also, if I am correct in this, prohibits the growth restrictions.
That's a separate bill.
Oh, it's a separate bill,
Yeah.
okay. But there's a significant impact, like you said, of water resources.
Yes.
And for mountain communities and other communities that didn't even worse than we are in terms of water. I think, having the local control ability to regulate what gets built there is the environmentally sustainable and responsible thing to do as well. And so that's something else to just kind of, it adds to the challenges of the statewide zoning program.
Is it true that that bill that would have taken away growth restrictions is dead for now?
I haven't
No?
seen an update on that.
There was a Senate version of it which the governor supported, which was introduced by the Republicans, and that was killed in the Senate committee. The House version, the Democrat version, which is also supported by the governor, is still in play and still yet to be heard. It's not been in committee yet, but the governor is driving this, and if you've kept track of his record, he's gotten his way on everything, and that's the scary part of this, is that it's almost out of control.
So I do have a note we can add in the, perhaps in the agenda, the memo for the next packet, just an update on where those land use bills stand too.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great.
That's
Yeah.
a great idea, Paul.
We're gonna-
It's not too late.
Yeah, and if something happens, we'll reach out.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like we're kind of, it sounds like what I'm hearing is we're gonna keep doing what we're doing
Yeah.
Yeah.
and keep an eye on that.
And
Yeah.
And if something comes down from above that, because that has been gone through the court challenges, and which my guess is this is gonna be tied up in court well beyond the finish line of this project, but if something comes down from above that we have to conform to, then we either file a lawsuit or conform.
Or there's strategies that we might be able to employ. We might have backup strategy. Like we might continue down the path that we want to continue down, knowing that this is going to be litigated to death, but we have backup strategies in place. We can spend a lot of time on that. We have our eye on it. That's the key. I think we're in a good position because we're already engaged. We have resources devoted to this work. And if we need to pivot, then we'll do that if we need to do that. So.
we can probably go to item 5.
Okay.
So next, we have the presentation and discussion on the diagnostic, the code diagnostic report. I'm sure you all read through this in great detail. Basically an examination of our current code and its many foibles and flaws. So we will hear from Nolan Case.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for your questions and your continued attention. I know that it is, the meeting's been going on, so thank you for your continued attention. So ZoneCo produced the zoning diagnostic report at the beginning of this year. And this will be available for public access once we finalized anything based on comments from you after this meeting. That will be available on the Lafayette Listens page once we get that in the final version. Today, we will take a glimpse at the report and discuss some key findings and recommendations. First, you might ask, what is a diagnostic report? The zoning diagnostic report is an assessment of the existing zoning code that you already have, not the future one, the one you already have, and how it contributes to or interferes with the objectives of the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan has 4 key objectives. So there on the left of this slide is the wheel that shows those 4 key objectives. Those are connected community, strong economy, environmental stewardship, and community character. Within each of those objectives, it set more specific policy goals and strategies. For example, within the community character objective, the comprehensive plan says, orient development in the city around functional and vibrant public places. And then in addition to these 4 key objectives, ZoneCo added in a 5th major objective, and we do this with almost all of our diagnostic reports. So it wasn't that we just added it in for you, but we try to look at any code and say, is this easy to use by the general public as a democratic document? Within those objectives, we assessed every provision of the existing code, and we scored each provision as either supportive, unaffecting, or interfering with each of the key objectives. Through this, we generated a narrative to indicate where the code is succeeding or failing in achieving the community's vision. But some people may ask, why are we reviewing the existing code when we're just going to be writing a new one anyway? Well, when we're rewriting, there are portions that we may want to carry forward into the future code. We will be changing a lot of the document, so we may want to not change every single paragraph of every section. Some sections may work well in the way that they are. For example, perhaps the definition of dwelling unit is appropriate and should remain in the new code. This assessment gives us some idea of what areas are working and what areas aren't working. In this process, we approach the code with little local knowledge. So at the beginning of this meeting, all of you introduced yourselves as being involved in different aspects of the community. Some of you have lived in the community for decades, but we come with little local knowledge. I have been to Lafayette before. I have lived in Denver, traveled to other cities within the region. I have sipped a few Oscar Blues and Breckenridges, but I'm not a local, and I don't want to claim that I have that local knowledge. Therefore, when I approach this code, and when I approach a code from any of the cities that we work with, I approach it with fresh eyes. And those eyes have seen dozens and dozens of other codes from across the country. In this way, I may see things that you don't see because you see those things as normal, but I may see them as unique. I use a metaphor of you, the city, going to a doctor's office. At that doctor's office, you see a seasoned doctor, but it's a doctor that you've never seen before. And that doctor, new to seeing you, will look at your history, palpate your abdomen, peer into your ears and your throat, ask you questions about your lifestyle, check your nervous system for responses, may analyze your blood or your urine. The doctor is assessing what's going well and what's not going well, and may see some things, maybe that large mole on your back that's out of the ordinary and concerning, where you may have just thought, oh, that's just how it is, or that's my birthmark. And in the case of this code, we're looking at it to see if there's anything unique that could be interfering with the community vision. Ultimately, as the doctor, as a zoning professional, I want you to be able to achieve those community visions as indicated in the comprehensive plan. And so that's why I drew out these critiques, both good and bad, of your existing code. The diagnostic report falls towards the beginning of this entire process, and it sets us on the path for the next steps, the new code outline, map, and calibration table. And we'll talk about those in a moment. So on to some key findings from this diagnostic report. There are many, you can read it and find more, but I pulled out 10 to go off of and 10 recommendations on the next slide. So first, I wanted to talk about tables and defined terms added to the ease of use. However, more tables and graphics could be added to increase that ease of use. And that is something that we are planning to do in any update of a code, is to add those graphics and add those tables so that people can visualize things rather than just read them. Number two, the administration and procedures section is unclear. What permits are needed? What types of review are necessary? Which list of required submittals apply to your project? And whether the application will be reviewed by an administrator or through public hearings of the Planning Commission and City Council. It uses the terms special use review, but also special review use, and also special use approval. All of these add to the unclearness of the administration and procedures section. Along with that, the approvals are burdensome. The code requires that certain developments go through a long and burdensome PUD process. This disincentivizes certain types of development. And even if the development does occur, it adds to the costs of such development, which could result in higher rents for residential and commercial tenants. Furthermore, many applications must go through neighborhood comment periods, the Planning Commission, and City Council, which is atypical and makes even standard permitted uses subject to the whims of 3 political bodies. Next, urban design outcomes are not supported. While there are some provisions that help address architecture, such as requiring an architectural compatibility review for a site plan approval and cultural and character-based criteria for approval of PUDs, the code generally lacks standards that focus on architectural elements such as frontage tapes and landscape scale height transitions. Number 5, the code does not encourage an efficient use of land. Efficient use of land is linked to increased sustainability, as each person takes up less natural habitat and causes less impervious surface. Efficient use of land is also linked to decreased costs per acre, as more housing units or business units can locate within a given area. Efficient use of land is also linked to more efficient transmission of services, whether that's fire, police, electricity, gas, sewage, water. And efficient use of land is linked to higher governmental revenues per acre, important in expanding city services and making Lafayette a desirable place to live. In this code, however, large parking areas are required, buildings are limited to low heights, lots require large minimum areas, and buildings are required to be located far from other buildings and the street with large setbacks. Of course, there are sections of Lafayette that do achieve land use efficiency, and there are, of course, some parts of Lafayette where inefficiency is desirable. So I'm not saying that increased efficiency should be applied universally, but it is a concern in many parts of the city. Next, number 6, related to land use efficiency is the next finding, parking minimums being excessive. Parking minimums are problematic for many reasons. They are aesthetically unappealing, which damages the community character of Lafayette, one of the comp plan's key objectives. Next, they take up huge amounts of space, which increases the cost of development, renting, and owning a property, and decreases the revenues going to the city, decreasing the strength of economy in Lafayette, another key objective. Next, they encourage driving and discourage walking and other human speed forms of transportation as they separate destinations and make walking feel more dangerous, thereby decreasing the goal of connected community. And finally, they increase the use of cars, which pollutes the air and soundscape, and they cause great amounts of stormwater runoff, take up land that could be habitat, all factors in diminishing the quality of the environment, another key objective. Number 7, the code does support some water conservation measures. When I was reading through the existing code, I often came across mention of native species of plants and xeriscaping in the landscaping regulations. And it also requires that water quality and quantity are evaluated when reviewing application for PUDs. However, there are other water conservation measures that could be implemented in the future land use code. Next, number 8, transit is not supported through transit-oriented development and transit supporting development, TSD. Transit is coming to Lafayette, connecting it to Boulder, surrounding county or cities within Boulder County, and to light rail stations in the south. This is a great opportunity to reduce carbon emissions, noise, and smog from private vehicles, free up people from the burdens of car ownership, and meet the community's goal of a strong economy, connected community, and sustainable environment. However, the code does not take advantage of transit nodes, or the future transit nodes, I should say, and it does not support transit with adequate housing densities nearby those transit nodes. We can address this in a future land use code. Number 9, almost the end, the code restricts economic development. In many areas, maximum heights are short. For example, in the industrial district, M1, height is limited to 35 feet. But most warehousing today needs clear story heights of at least 36 feet, making the structures about 42 feet tall. Few commercial uses are permitted in the T1 district, which interferes with business development, and many residential areas in mixed-use commercial areas do not permit home occupations. And number 10, lastly, of course not least, actually maybe most important is housing. Housing is a huge concern in every city in the Denver metro. Here in Lafayette, housing is restricted through limited use types and minimum lot areas. Nursing homes, convalescent homes, and assisted living facilities must go through special approval processes to be permitted anywhere in the city. And multifamily housing is limited to very low densities, making them nearly impossible to build outside of a PUD process. Next, we will move to recommendations. So what do we do about these critiques, or what do we do about other items on that diagnostic report that were highlighted? And I will provide some recommendations. Number one, add graphics and tables. So you already have some, but many more would aid in the ease of use and comprehensibility of this document. Clarify and expedite the permitting process and consolidate the permitting process into one section of the code. Next, minimize or eliminate the use of PUDs. PUDs take a long time to approve, and while you may get specific positive positive elements coming from those PUDs, we may be able to bake those into the by right standards. Number four, add design regulations such as building types and frontage types. This would help achieve the community character objectives in the comprehensive plan. Next, support transit and take advantage of transit. So transit is coming to Lafayette. We can support that transit by adding density near those transit nodes. And we can also take advantage of that transit, people coming for jobs or for shopping. Next, eliminate off-street parking minimums. Of course, I illustrated some of the ill effects of off-street parking in its relation to Lafayette's planning objectives. Next, increase land use efficiency. Number 8, allow for senior-friendly housing options by right. I work in a lot of communities where people say, I want to stay here, but I don't want to take care of this property. I don't feel that I can take care of a 3-bedroom home anymore. I live here on my own. I don't want to mow, etc. It's quite a burden, but I want to stay here where my community is, where I've lived. I've been going to the same grocery store for decades. I have my friends at the rec center, etc. And I don't want to leave. Where can I go that is a low maintenance option? And so when we look for senior friendly housing options, we'll also be looking at generally low maintenance options for people, whether they're seniors or not. Next, number 9, permit more diverse business uses within the use table and height regulations. And you know, I'm not on number 9, I'm not saying height relax height regulations in all areas. I'm only saying where appropriate. And I specifically called out an example related to the M1 district. Number 10, consolidate all definitions into one section. This makes the code easier to use and easier to locate those definitions. Again, when I was reviewing this code, it did a relatively good job compared to some other codes that I've looked at, or the many other codes I've looked at in defining terms. But we will, of course, ensure that when introducing a new term, and all use-related terms should be defined and clear, so that when somebody's applying for a particular project, they can look at the zoning document and say, do I fit within this zone? And what definition do I fit into? And that should be clear to the reader and clear to anyone administering and enforcing this document. Next, so we have, I just introduced a lot of different things to you. Do you have any questions about this diagnostic report? And are there any of the findings that are surprising to you, or have I missed something that you expected to see and didn't see?
So really quickly, this is our consultant's take on the zoning code, and I will say we will be able. The purpose of this group is to weigh in on all that. Like, how much do we want to go in one direction or not? How much, like, let's use parking as an example. Are we gonna eliminate parking requirements? Or are we gonna right-side parking requirements? Are we gonna eliminate parking requirements in certain areas? These are all considerations that we'll be talking through. Height as well. And it was interesting because I'm listening to Nolan go through the list. And I know there are things in that list that are likely to touch a nerve with some folks. And so let's talk through that. Let's talk through that, but knowing that we're gonna be able to shape that stuff. So I am curious to hear what y'all think. So, that's why we're here. So, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because of some of the things he listed as negatives, were not accidental, they were intentionally done that way.
Like what?
To have a negative effect. So,
Such as,
well, the number of meetings, public meetings and things around that's a much newer thing in the city. And that was done with intention, realizing the impact, that was not accidental.
I would counter that is that a good way of doing business though, is to that part of the process and dragging things out and to get an outcome.
Well, I think that's a little bit unfair, because Jeff just mentioned the PUD is in place because the code isn't quite up to date yet. And the reason to have those meetings is to actually come out with what the new code might allow us to do in a more efficient way. That's my understanding.
so that change in process was a result of lots of PUDs and lots of inconsistencies. So
Right.
let's try to direct the process from an earlier point and try to get closer to what we want until we can do the zoning code rewrite and use the comp plan as a basis for that. So
Just, just about every project I've done in Colorado in 20 years has almost been a PUD. I've done very little street zoning, working mostly in suburban Denver metro area. I can, only one or two instances of just going straight to the residential zoning code and being able to build something out of that. It's quite rare. Not with the new Denver zoning code, but sort of that's the case.
I just wanna say, in Boulder, there are over 5,000 PUDs. We don't even have a map of all of them. We don't have records of all of them. It can be a logistical nightmare for our homeowners to figure out what they can and cannot add. And it also is an incredible workload for city staff to do the research and try to provide documentation in most cases. So, anything that we can do to move away from PUDs here, I think would be, ideal. So that people have a clear understanding of what their project is and what they can and can't do without requiring intensive work hours from city staff.
From a staff perspective and from a person on the other line of the phone, it's frustrating to say, what are my setbacks? And you can say, I need to get back to you and look through
just answer it.
a half hour of documents. So that's,
Will this project do anything with existing PUDs? Is there consideration to?
can I explore what are the options? I think that this group needs to weigh in on that. There are a half dozen or so that have vesting rights, and so that provides another layer that we, but
Yeah, our advice is to get rid of PUDs.
Existing as well.
Yeah, and to figure out a mechanism that does that without handicapping like things that are no longer conforming as a result of. Like, when you have 5,000 PUDs, you have 5,000 zoning codes. And so you have to craft some mechanisms to allow things that we allowed to be built to expand and people improve in their properties and all that. So that's where like flexibility in the code is important. If you get rid of PUDs, if we go that route. There's also like, tell what you want and you'll get what you want. If you can't articulate what you want, you have to have all these complicated processes to engage to figure that out, and there's a whole bunch of issues. So that's what our recommendation is gonna be once we get to that point, is to try to figure out a way to eliminate PUDs, maybe with the exception of exceptional situations, which hopefully are exceptional and not the rule. So that's something that we definitely want to talk about and engage in.
Okay, I have a reaction.
Yeah.
I think these recommendations are really amazing, but we're all gonna feel a little pain because it's a change in behavior. we're asking people for ways in which to be more efficient of land use. That means more density. And one of the things about being here is the fact that you can see a lot of openness in front of you. And so how's that gonna weigh? How are you gonna weigh it based on the urban farm that is required to facilitate the things that you really want in the comprehensive plan, which are for public engagement, biking, walking, and all these things. So
But also more affordable housing.
more affordable housing, right? So that's one thing. So you can see the tensions already built in, right? Because we're asking for a change in behavior. That is hard to do as a forum builder. You know, you're trying something that you're saying, well, I'm going to enforce this because it's going to make for a better living for who? You're gonna get that response, right? So how do you, these recommendations I think are great because I think a lot of cities do them to some varying degree of success. And, you know, this is an American experience. I'd say it that way only because I've lived in 4 different countries and 4 different cities and 4 large cities, which have a very different feel to them, right? Because they're, the way they understand city planning is different. So the question underneath some of this is how is the current plan, the city plan, going to facilitate some of this? Will your city plan have to change grid-wise, block-wise, you know, even to the smallest point of the unit itself in order to support the most important things and that is more density, less cars, more open, you know, so there's there seems to be something underlying underneath that hasn't quite been talked about, right? So I just want to know how we
I
think
think
about
the
that.
word, I would trade out the word change for evolve, because
Evolve,
a
okay.
city,
Excellent.
it's, you know, we've started as a small town.
Mhm.
It will be a growing town, not ever going to become a city per se, and like, you know,
Okay.
the cities do that, but an evolution occurs in any place where humans live. And so we're guiding that evolution. We've seen
Absolutely. Yeah.
We've seen how it has impacted other towns in the Front Range and all the issues they're dealing with. So we all take our input and say, okay, how do we want our town to evolve? I think because we have the comp plan, yeah, we see all that tension, but we have to let that guide us and balance, you know, some people we want absolutely maximum height of 35 feet. Okay, but we also want affordable housing. So how can we make sure that we have garden level apartments and then we switch, you know, the buildings so we can have four, you know, stories, things like that.
I
And so,
totally get that.
Yeah.
I'm asking the question here, you wanna support transit, you know, change something fundamentally to do it, you know, like, the reason why maybe some things are the way they are is because it wasn't didn't see this future we can evolve, right, evolve. And so, I'm trying to find a way in which we talk about these so we can actually provide input that's going to have, that you can easily say, hey, that's doable and reasonable. Okay, not, no, don't tread on me type thing, which is hard to do sometimes, yeah, so.
one thing that I think will help a lot is like you said, seeing the future. I think just passing that book around, seeing some of the graphics in that book. I think we really need a lot of graphics, even as we're discussing things here. You know, Nolan, you mentioned the Word document. I just want to caution that we are not just looking at words on a page. It's got to have lots of graphics. We have to have a clear understanding of if we make this change in this language, this is what we might come up with. It's not designing it, but these are the potentialities so that you can see, oh, that won't have a big impact, or oh, wow, that's definitely not what we want.
I think graphics are really good, but they're also really hard.
Yes, they can.
If you don't do the graphic well.
Yeah.
Then it's counterproductive.
So one of the reasons we selected this team is because of their expertise and their skill in helping visualize some of these concepts that we're gonna talk through.
Okay.
About scale and everything. And so Nolan mentioned charrettes. Do folks know what a charrette is? It's a design exercise. It occurs in a very short period, but it's a very interactive design exercise where we can explore different concepts in real time. about how these regulations that we're considering might actually manifest themselves. What if we change it? What if, like, right now, our predominant height in our residential neighborhoods is 27 feet? What happens if we change that to 30 feet? What happens if we change the definition of how we measure height? And yeah, like you talked about, concepts of stories, stories and like, well, what happens if you have a garden level and it doesn't really impact the maximum height? Like, I've said this to the planning commission a lot of times, density is just a calculation. It's kind of like when we talked about conventional codes. It doesn't really illustrate what's permitted. A number can manifest itself in many different ways. So we like to talk about the urban design aspects, the outcomes, and intensity. Intensity as it relates to the height and lot coverage and lot size and stuff like that. But you can still have very small town built forms that the calculation ends up that it's denser than you would realize. Even with an old town, like there's dense stuff going in Old Town, but it's not 5-story buildings, it's not massive structures. But when you do the calculation, you're like, oh, that's what, 50 dwelling units to an acre? Even though there's only might be 15 dwelling units that we're looking at. So this is the exciting part, I think, is like we have this great team that Nolan is like, we're gonna be able to like visualize and talk through this stuff and help figure out what the best results for Lafayette are.
And I would encourage you when shaping conversations within your own head, within this group and with others, when you talk to them, is really focusing on, yeah, change is difficult. The idea of a zoning code is, part of the idea is to create stability. So by rewriting it, we're creating some disruption in that stability, right? And so there's some discomfort with that, and that's normal. But really focusing on, is this change going to get us closer to those objectives in the comprehensive plan? And if they are, then great, let's really consider them. And if there are things that people are uncomfortable about, really digging into what about it is difficult. So for example, if people say, I just don't really want, that to be a 4-plex, I'd rather it be a single or a 1-unit dwelling. And it's like, okay, what about a 4-plex is uncomfortable? And maybe through that conversation, you realize, oh, the thing that that person doesn't want with the 4-plex is parking on the street and battling for parking. And you say, okay, so really the issue is not it being a 4-plex. The real issue is finding parking and parking regulations, et cetera. So, or maybe you find out, okay, the real issue is noise. And so trying to dig deep into what about it is uncomfortable, or what about it is creating a particular fear. And then we can address that particular thing without sacrificing the element that could be contributing to the community's objectives.
Yeah, and one last thing, like we all in our minds, we tend to go to the worst case scenario. So there are things that we're going to talk about within our new housing developments that might look different from our existing housing developments. And as a group, we'll have to formulate a recommendation of, well, if it's good enough for the new stuff, is it good enough for the existing stuff? And maybe the answer is no, right? And so like, just because we might enable a 4-plex in a new residential neighborhood doesn't mean the entirety of Lafayette would automatically, within a period of a year, turn into 4-plexes. So it's like also remembering what likely is going to happen, like realistically what is going to happen. We don't have a lot of area for new neighborhoods left. So if we do innovate in new neighborhoods, is the impact of it really transform the city or not? And if the answer is no, but maybe we want to consider some, then we have those conversations. Or the answer could be no. So this is the fun stuff that we'll be able to dig into.
So you have a comment?
Yeah, I have I guess a comment and a question. My comment kind of goes back to what Frank and to a certain degree what Mike was saying about, well, on what Frank was saying is that well, I think we all agree, especially members of the planning commission, that PUDs are cumbersome, and staff would probably agree too. But having something being cumbersome, we shouldn't get rid of it because it's cumbersome. You know, the way I see a PUD is it was put in, that whole process there was implemented for a reason. And in my view, that core reason was so that Lafayette can move closer to getting the development outcomes that we want, as opposed to what is brought to us. And a PUD is, you know, maybe it shouldn't be required for certain small units, but it is what it is. But in the PUD, it's reviewed by staff, it's reviewed by planning commission, it's reviewed by city council. And a big part of that review is comparing the building project itself versus our code, but also our comp plan, and then a set of 3 criteria, being best interest of the city and highest and best use and so on and so forth. That was put there so we can try to get more of the outcomes we want, as opposed to what's brought to us. Is it cumbersome? Absolutely. If we could get to a point with the new code, where the new code is just prescriptive enough, but not too prescriptive, but it's like the sweet spot where we can actually get what we want without having to do that process and just have it be basically a by right use gets us what we want. That would be great. The other thing with the PUD though, it's often used as a tool to circumvent zoning regulations. You are allowed to apply to break regulations A through B, C, D, and E through the PUD as well, and even single lots. This isn't just 5 units or more, even single lots. Like I had to build 3 parking spaces for an ADU, off-street parking spaces, and I was thinking about going through a PUD process, and it was like, that fifth thing. But I didn't want to do it because it was cumbersome. Like, I'll just build 3 parking spaces off-street for that. So it's the PUD is used by building projects of all sizes to get around the rules. And in fact, I can't remember a single building project of any size that I followed in Lafayette that hasn't had a fairly significant violation of code. If we can, so I guess what I'm saying is if we can also get, you know, that would be another thing. If we can get to a code that actually doesn't, like, okay, if we have the right code, maybe that desire could also go away. That function of the PUD can also go away. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it does in my mind. But my question is, we were talking mostly about chapter 26 in the code. Is chapter 47, the historic preservation chapter, is that part of the purvey of this effort or not?
No, I think the preservation board wants to explore changes to 47 and they're having those conversations. I don't want to speak for the board members, but they're having those conversations now.
It's,
So-
so certain things are on our work plan.
Yeah,
To make some modifications and updates to the code language, to make processes clearer, define things better. And then make clear what is a staff level review for certificates of appropriateness, that sort of thing. And then we're also taking a look at, some of the language and, considering some alternatives to historic districts in terms of like a cultural landscape, kind of areas. So, but all that is projected for 2024, on our work. So nothing other than definitions and clarity for this year.
I mean, I will say, like, there might be areas that we go into that it makes sense, that we might want to look at. Something in a different chapter of the municipal code, yeah, because there's overlap with chapter 30, there's overlap with some of the public works sections about water. So there might be areas where we look, hey, maybe this is better off in the preservation code versus the zoning code. Could be that there are things that the preservation folks board wants that are better off not being a preservation oriented thing, but actually a design element within the zoning code. So what we have, that's why we want them here and participating. So great question. It's not intended to go there yet, but I mean, if we need to, the opportunity presents itself and it makes more sense, we definitely be open to it, but we want to make sure that we're working hand in hand with the preservation board on that.
And there is a lot of overlap, basically, on 6. You know, the ADUs are kind of used as an incentive for preservation in the whole town overlay areas. And, so questions concerning ADUs and how those might be regulated or used, as incentives if they are allowed elsewhere. You know, what does that do? What do we need to look at in terms of, incentivizing preservation in other ways? For the downtown area. I think that's an important discussion that we are hopefully here to have at some point.
Yeah, as she was speaking, I thought about one of those videos, and I don't know if it was a shaving video or one, but they mentioned the form-based code and talked about transects. And from a wildlife point of view, I'd like to explore more of how transects might look in the city where there's no development to lots of development. And so gradient that goes between.
So it was, the first transect was the ecological one, so it went from like the forest to the dune to the ocean. And then over time that evolved into like this zoning thing where it was form-based code, the organizing element was the transect. And so instead of a certain type of zone, it was a T for transect, and it would be T1, T2, 3. And it went from that rural setting out to the urban core. And so that's the organizing principle of.
Yeah, I mean,
pretty common.
I will, maybe we should talk about that. Like, we have to talk about what the organizing principle is gonna be. We have some ideas to share with the group, probably at the next meeting. With the transect, I don't know if we have enough transects to have that. We definitely have a couple, but we can use that philosophy to help us regulate, because like our housing areas are definitely different outside of Old Town than they are within Old Town. And they might not be, from a scale perspective, they might not be different transects, but they're definitely different environments and contexts. So yeah, the concept is an interesting one. Yeah.
So I had a question about graphics, and we talked a lot about when you have a lot of graphics. As we're going through this process, I think graphics are good to include in the final code, but I wonder, as we're discussing, will we include photographs? So that I can, you know, I'm not a planner, so you tell me form-based code says X, I'm not gonna know, but you say, here's a picture that is no longer allowed by the new form-based code. I can say, okay, I can follow that, right? And so kind of having some of these, okay, if we change the code this way, this is, you know, and if we can have pictures from Lafayette to give us an example of this type of
Or
commercial
from
development.
Louisville.
Or from Louisville,
Or
I mean,
Denver, places that we know that are.
Yeah, that's a really good comment, and something that, so when creating graphics, what I would love to avoid from a project management and budget standpoint is recreating those graphics multiple times as we discuss things. So, for example, if we're discussing a place and we're discussing building height, for example, and we create a graphic that's 30 feet tall, and then we say, oh, actually, we're going to change it to 35, or oh, we're going to change it to 37, or oh, we're going to change it to 25, and we're recreating these graphics over and over. That's very labor intensive for us as consultants. And so I think the idea of showing photographs is a much better idea. It still gives you, the working group, an idea, a visual, but it is nowhere near as labor intensive as creating graphics. So we
I thought some of the photos that you showed on the presentation were really helpful to me to say, here's 2, you know, commercial zones. This is what we're maybe going towards. And if we have places that we all know, then it's easy to say, okay, this area is maybe not, if it were to be redeveloped, it couldn't look like this anymore.
And with graphics, it's always sunny and everybody has an ice cream cone and the cars are small in spaces. They're not reality.
Right.
And the streets won't fit a school bus.
Okay, there were a couple things, and I read the entire diagnostic report, so I feel like I should get a prize for that, so, thank you. There were a couple things that said we're in keeping with the comp plan that I don't really think were, in particular, some of the conclusions made around density. For instance, it says incentivizing different housing types other than single-family detached dwellings will encourage water efficiency. I'm wondering how. I mean, you're gonna have more density, more people, more water use. So I'd like to see how that would be addressed. Because I live in Old Town, I looked closely at that. One of the comments says, in the Old Town neighborhood overlay district, lot areas of at least 7,000 square feet per unit limit the efficient use of land and therefore increase housing scarcity and costs. I like to see the data behind that. This has been being brought up with the Polis plan I saw in the legislature. We do not have examples of that in Old Town. There's a development that some of you may know called Cannon Trail, which is a series of duplexes on single family lots. Those duplexes sell for at least $600,000 each. That's what the price of an existing home on a single family lot sells for. So what we've done is we've increased density and reduced lot sizes per house, which is, you know, one of these land use recommendations. But we have not created less expensive housing or more equitable housing. Instead, we promoted gentrification in one of the few areas of our city that still has diversity of income. And so I think that that's something that we need to take into account. Another issue is ADUs, as planning staff knows, love ADUs, would like to see them approved, and tiny homes. But again, in Old Town, where they are allowed, most of the ADUs are short-term rentals. I mean, I know of one property that I know personally, and so does Doug, that it's a 1,200 square foot house and a garage with a studio apartment in front and an ADU over that complex. It just sold for $1.1 million to an out-of-town investor who rents the units on Verbo. So again, how, and I know, Jeff, you know, you guys have brought that up, you know, what in planning commission has passed, you know, or recommended to council on how to modify, you know, moderate ADUs. But I'm concerned about these conclusions that I was seeing in the report, that somehow more density equals lower housing costs. And
I think in other places in this country, it might be. I don't think that's the case in the Front Range.
Yeah.
At all.
So you know, again, as you mentioned, Patrick, if we're gonna sell this to the people, how are we gonna do it? You're gonna have a bunch more places near you, and they're gonna cost a lot of money, you know?
It's a really good question, because that's where I think you write it into the code that, as Denver has it, a percentage of whatever is developing in there must be affordable. That's, I mean, it's
But,
mandated.
and again, we need to define that, because
You have
80%
to define
AMI
it, that's
is
true, you
not
have to define it, but the thing
affordable.
is, you do,
Right.
and then you incentivize it,
Right.
you say you don't have to have that parking, or whatever it is. So, it's interesting, I completely understand your dilemma, we have this dilemma all the time when we're working with other cities. And developers are really like upset, you're telling me how to do this to not make my margin, my performer.
Right.
Well, interestingly enough, the incentivization on the affordable housing in Denver is actually much more effective in terms of like what you can get. You don't have to provide that much more parking. You don't have to worry about, you know, certain other things that you would have had to if you were going to do a market rate all the way through. So we just have to study that and figure it out for Lafayette, right? It's different.
See, we had that. We had an affordable housing ordinance that did those things, and it failed. And one of the reasons it failed was what you called incentivization, because that was put on the back of the developers, okay, to carry most of the costs. with doing that, okay? And now the only way we have found so far moving forward, make that equation work, is if the city does it in conjunction with Boulder County Housing Authority or some other government entity, not by
In one place.
independent.
Yeah,
Independent
totally.
people
That's
doing it.
exactly what the other cities are doing actually, but they're saying that you don't have to. You don't have
When
to-
you're saying write it in the code, we tried that and then it.
There's gotta be a way to
was a different
incentivize it on an
time.
infill.
I mean,
Well, no, they
basis,
didn't
since that's
wind
what
up
we have is
being
infill,
that
but
much,
we're
they
gonna
didn't
deal
wind up being that affordable, and people said, why would I, give up the ability to get, whatever the increase in the value of my house is, for this really small break.
It's a real balance, I
And it costs.
absolutely understood, it's a real balance, but you have to kind of look at it from what the goals are of the comprehensive plan, right, of these legacies out there. And I wanted to just ask this question about density. I lived in a city, in a little suburbs, a little enclave out in Denver called Lincoln Park. And Lincoln Park basically was a Latinx neighborhood. There are 2 families per 750 square feet home, right? Okay, that's density. Each one of those families brings in an income, they use the same water meter, all that sort of thing. But it's in that small, tiny envelope, right? So when you talk about density in terms of more, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It may just mean that, but there's more inside of it. So we have to kind of really define what we mean by this, because density in other places means a way of living that looks really like contained. But it's, and in other places it means, like Jeff said, 7,000 square feet broken up into like pieces, because it fits with the neighborhood. So we just want to define these things a little bit more.
Well, I think we need to make sure they're gonna work. I mean, I'm concerned about having a bunch of stuff in the code to encourage affordable housing, which does not.
Yeah.
And, I have one other thing, can I say that too, about it's under the strong economy section, specifically the part about removing economic barriers that stifle mobility by making business startup difficult for those with less access to capital. And that was to remove some of the language calling for more public input, neighborhood meetings, 10-day public online comment forms, noticing nearby property owners, and the requirement that development applications go through a public hearing and planning commission review, that this is potentially putting barriers on business owners. And I think it's important, and for also the consultant to note that some of these provisions were recently added at residents' requests. And the goal has been to add more public participation and transparency in the process instead of less. We've been told over and over again, do not make it unfriendly to the developers. And I think finally Lafayette residents pushed back and said, we need more public input. We need more opportunity for this. So I think that, going in and removing that kind of stuff, I think is going to have some public pushback, from what I've heard. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
When we're presenting the kind of the diagnostic or conversation moving forward, it'd be really helpful to have it's in there a bit of like, this enforces the comp plan, but it's words. So if we can figure out a graphic, quick index of, here's the 10 policies we have in our legacy Lafayette pie and they're pretty colors. Can we find a way to index those pretty colors into the reports? Like, I love that it was well laid out, formatted, but it was also bright red throughout. And so it was hard to know which one was, you guys obviously had that conversation, right?
Well, we were given a department color during the branding study. We are fire truck red, yeah. So that's a department color.
So a non-planner chose the planning department's color, obviously.
We don't have to stick to it.
Angry color.
We don't have to stick with it, but that's the backstory.
Excellent.
Right.
It's fine. It was when I'm reading through it, I wanted a quick like you did on the slide,
visual
smiley
reference.
face, sad face, or red, yellow, green, and the same as we start to move into really deep kind of conversations about the balance of and trade-offs of, like, well, which policies, even if it's the big bucket, not necessarily a list of 27 policies, but like, oh, we are focusing on this color wheel.
Mhm.
And then along the graphics and photos, anytime the consultant can drop a pin and we can start to create a Google map of places where we can go to and put in our place view and look around. It doesn't have to be necessarily Lafayette or our own photos. Those are great, but we're talking about what the new code may allow or doesn't allow. And there could be examples that maybe I'm not gonna drive over to because they're 200 miles away, but I can drop a pin in and put on Street View and look up and down.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I like that.
Two short things, and that's all I got for today, I promise. First, on the density question, I think there are arguments in favor of density in certain cases. Affordability is not one of them, as you said, that just flies in the face of practical experience on the Front Range. Denver and Boulder are where the Plan Boulder has come out against this whole bolus idea, and in their statement, they said Denver and Boulder are the two most dense cities in the state. Guess where, no one could afford to live Denver, Boulder. So
Everybody wants
density
to-
does not
It's a
equal.
supply issue. Everybody wants to be there.
Yeah,
That's why they're
like I said, yeah, so
expensive,
on the
because
Front
everybody
Range,
wants to be there.
everyone wants to be in the
And so
Front
they
Range.
are building density, and yes, there is an increased cost, but hey,
No,
right,
but I don't view affordability, especially on the Front Range, as an argument in favor of density. It's just,
It has to speak to our other values.
yeah, and there are other reasons. I don't see water efficiency as being a strong argument in favor of density. There are other ones like efficient land use, of course, but affordability and density just I don't see those. And then the second thing, what I was saying before about, PUDs and so forth. One thing Jeff said is that our code is never gonna catch there will always be corner cases. There will be uses that we just, they're just not gonna be covered. And we do need some kind of process for it to have some kind of flexibility to look at things that we do want, but that aren't prescribed or allowed by code X, Y, and Z. They should be. I do think your statement about extreme cases, I think that's very appropriate, not just because somebody asked for it.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, exactly. We've been handing out PUDs like, lollipops. So what I find interesting though is like, I think you all are hitting upon the topics that are probably gonna generate the most conversation and trying to figure out how do we right size it? And like, I heard public input and when Phil and I read that, we told Nolan, hey, this was an intentional thing, blah, blah, blah. To South's point, maybe if we get the right regulations in place, not everything needs to have public input, but maybe public input is situational or based upon the size of what's being proposed or based upon a use. But is it everything? So I want to have these conversations because I think it's going to be interesting to see why do we have this in place now? What is the history behind it? Another one is the senior living. I know there's a lot of history behind that too. Why are they so scarce in our code and bringing that history to the table, talking through that and saying, okay, asking the questions, what problems are we trying to solve here? And is this the right way to solve it? So those are gonna be interesting things that we engage upon within this group. Yeah.
You're talking about senior housing and affordable housing particularly. We have no idea of the demographics of the existing housing. The county has that. And can we have access to that? Who is the typical renter of Josephine Commons?
Oh,
That was the next greatest thing to slice bread and it's next to my house and those neighbors and myself wanted that to be where the church is, where Rocky Mountain Church is. And the county owned the parking, which is now a parking lot. And we didn't get the time of day in that process. And here we are, 15, 20 years later, we're doing that. So it's encouraging that we're making some progress of this you know, it's not a sudden epiphany. There are people in our community who have argued that to the end of the earth and got nowhere with it. But if, as Vicky said, having some basis for study or some local trends or local findings or something science-based, some participation from the county, because we need to know what is the affordable housing there and who are the occupants, and the senior component of it, who are the occupants, and we don't have to know names, not asking for names, but what is the typical scenario of building more affordable housing?
Well, I think the goal is not just, I think it's more of a range of people dispersed throughout the community, rather than having these people live there and those people live there. That's
Agreed.
really,
I agree.
so I think to Jeff's point about a lot of our projects in the future are going to be infill. How do we make sure that it's a little more democratic and that people aren't just shoehorned into one spot or another?
Yeah, like the senior housing, I think my understanding is that there was a concern about resources. Emergency, like response times and resources. And so is that tied to the size of the project? And if it's tied to the size of the project, should we focus on that rather than prohibiting like these in-home solutions that are out there, that our definition of family doesn't allow? Right, where you have more than 3 unrelated people wanting to live together in a typical single family house where they can get more personal care for a variety of things. And so like being able to understand the basis of why we have these things already is important. There's a lot like senior housing, the neighborhood outreach process, mixed use complexes, residential PUD, approval criteria. These are all things that happens within this community, but they're not in the code. They revolve somewhere else. So we want to daylight all that and make sure we don't forget about the lessons we learned in the past and ask, are they still valid? Are they working, or is there a better way to approach it on some of these more interesting topics? Yeah.
I guess one more question, as we are moving into these, again, more in-depth topics, can the consultant or team present, in addition to the, here's the recommendation, but what if we didn't touch it, current code, as well as what if we got rid of regulation altogether in this, when we're talking heights or footprint or meetings or, right, so that we're always remembering that we don't always have to regulate it. But if we don't, here's the risks, or here's the other impacts that it may.
I think that's a good idea.
And my bias is to just get rid of as many rules as possible, so just putting that out there.
But I
As a
do
lover of
think,
code.
I mean, the comp plan, the surveys for the comp plan, people didn't want the height and density of it, very adamant about that. So if we're gonna do it, then I think we have to show,
Just understanding at least of like, well,
right, what is
Worst
this
case.
do? Yeah. Mhm.
And I think the developer perspective will be really important in those conversations, because many times you're coming up with saying like, well, if I didn't have any rules, this is what I'd be building here, versus okay, maybe some boundaries are a good idea.
You asked about hot button topics. Transit's one for me, and I hope this doesn't create a rabbit hole, but I think technology and pandemics lead me to believe that we're gonna see driverless electric Uber taxis before we see full RTD buses again. Well, or resizing of the RTD fleet to accommodate the traffic. And electric vans or buses, but I just think to Guy's point, trying to guess, 15, 20 years down the road, what transit's gonna look like. I think we're on the verge of it getting turned upside down.
I think it could be.
hot topic in planning circles.
Yeah.
Autonomous vehicles and what that does to congestion.
Or doesn't.
Yeah.
Or doesn't.
Are we gonna move on to our final next steps?
Sure, I think, really just briefly, it looks like, again, more technical things, so we can just maybe provide a few comments.
Yeah, but I was knowing that at the very beginning, we talked about public input.
Oh.
So is this a time to engage on that, before we go to next steps?
I think does our public want to input?
A couple of things that jump out to me. The comp plan is the community's document. Discussions about getting rid of code completely or those things that go way away from what the comp plan is concern me. The comp plan is the driver here. And that's the community's document, and things like height and density, as Vicky brought up, were very important to the community. So we can't just, okay, let's just go ahead and do this, without being driven by the comp plan. And, the public input has always been a big thing for me, and anytime I hear that there's too much, that concerns me as well. The community needs to be able to speak on things. Projects are going in next door to them, they should be able to talk about what the impact is on their life. And a lot of what happens is that, the property rights for the new person coming in seem to overrule the property rights of the person that's already there. And I think we need to be really aware of that. And the reason why we added those extra steps within the development review process came from the public saying, you're putting in this big development next to me. I work full time, I have a family, I'm not a developer, this is not my whole life. I need more time to look at what the impact of this development is going to have on my life and research and, learn about traffic problems and learn about this and come to the meeting ready to make my case. And that's why the development review process was extended and more places for the public to speak was put in there. I went to a billion chat with council meetings, and people kept showing up and saying the same thing. We're being pushed into doing this without having time to really do our research. So anytime I hear even consultants saying, oh, you've got too much public input in here, please don't. Just keep in mind that the public needs to be able to speak and give their input on these projects. Thank you.
I love that. The more the public speaks, but I think it's really important that staff and council set a clear tone of, are we informing or empowering? And there's a whole spectrum there of what we're doing with our public engagement and being real clear on what the expectation is. Because although you may create a forum for people to come and speak, what are we doing with that information? And we, this group, are just advisory, but what is council doing about it? Are they making the trade-off there? So that as a resident of the public, if I spend my time coming to a meeting and doing all the research and making my comments, and then this person at the dais says, thanks for that, but the rules are already set, have a great day, I'm not feeling like a good trust and transparency out of that.
And I think another part of it is the scale of the project, when it's one business owner wanted to come in and use an existing building and make it, start his business there versus 350 new housing units. Yeah, there's a big differentiation and impact there. So that's finding that sweet spot of the scale of the project and how much input is going to be really important.
I think the form-based code gives us an opportunity to perhaps mitigate some of the need for public input because there is a buffer zone, or you're creating the distance or the space so that you're not getting 350 unit apartment building built next to your residential complex or your residential home. And if we can accurately assess where those areas in town need to be, we can perhaps eliminate the concerns or the reactions that development can cause when it's happening near your own, because we all feel that, right? everyone has that like knee-jerk reaction of, oh my God, I don't want to live next to that. And so if we're structuring our code in a way that development has to happen in a certain way that creates enough space visually and physically, and can only happen at, you know, certain levels, a story and a half, at these distances from local residences, then maybe a lot of those concerns are mitigated. So I do think that we have an opportunity not to exclude the public, but through shaping this code, be able to take the public's input on the comprehensive plan and develop this so that we're presenting what people want, instead of having to have them come to a public meeting all the time to say, this isn't what we want. So this is the opportunity to say, okay, well, let's put in what we want.
That's so beautiful. I wish I had like written in our charter, somewhere of like, the purpose is bringing that community voice of what they want to see in their city, which was illustrated in the comp plan at a policy level, but operationalized in the zoning code. And why it's so important to tell your friends and neighbors, just watch this, like, this is what's planning, what can go next to their property.
Can I just jump in terms of wanting to sort of identify what we mean by the public? Because I've lived, when I came back to Lafayette, so the entire time I've lived in Lafayette, this last time, I've been a renter. And I've never bothered to show up for a public planning meeting because I figured it wouldn't matter what I said, because I'm just a renter. So the perception is that the only people whose voices really matter to the rest of us who aren't property owners are property owners, you know, single family home property owners. And yet we as renters can be very much impacted by what goes on in the, you know, in the area surrounding our particular unit. So I just think we need to be a little mindful about who and how we are reaching voices who are beyond just friends and neighbors in, you know, single family homes. So I'm now a renter at the other end of South Public Road in Traditions, you know. So I can speak a little bit about, you know, senior housing as well. I'll just say that when council was talking about sort of too many seniors living together in a place and causing too many emergency responses, we were a little annoyed, you know, to say the least. You know, it's spread us out through the, you know, the rest of the community, we'd still have the same health issues. You know, you'd still have to come and show up, you know, it just feels like it's more compact, I think. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth.
One thing that it comes up for me is the transit conversation and the fact that a lot of the comments that we get from the planning commission are about traffic and about transit and about cars. And so a lot of that we can't control as part of this, because it's CDOT, it's, you know, it's not necessarily within Lafayette, it's RTD, it's all these other, so it's, if there's a way that we can layer on that, hey, this is what CDOT is doing in this area, I know that's a big ask for your staff, but there's gotta be a way to have that, because we never have that understanding at planning commission.
It shouldn't be a big ask, so.
It shouldn't be, okay.
Yeah.
But we never have that understanding. It's always just, here we are looking at this project in a bubble, and we don't really know exactly what is happening and where anything is gonna change. You know, I'm hearing the consultant say something about new transit is coming to Lafayette. I'm like, is there something I missed? Is transit coming? Because I haven't heard that, and I'd like to know.
Yeah.
So that's something that we can't impact, but that we need to understand as part of the context in a big way.
Absolutely.
Any other notes that you guys need to share? Or Nolan, are you back with?
Yes, I am back. I apologize, my internet cut out for some reason, so I am joining from my telephone at this point.
Okay.
We can probably just wrap up with a few notes about sort of what to expect next. And so just so you know, we're working in the background to create an engagement page, and once that's live, we'll let the group know. We think kind of the first step in this long process is to have a conversation about a couple of things. One would be, what's our approach to engagement? And so that's where there's some philosophical things about like, when do we inform the community versus when are we gonna be a bit more intentional about wanting to have their input on it and have kind of feedback loops and so on. And so we'll have those discussions and then start talking about the strategies that fit well with this project. And then separate from that, the meat and potatoes of that discussion would probably be what does the new zoning look like? And so right now we kind of have a list of zoning districts that are on a map. What's the next list of zoning districts look like? How do we organize these districts? They're currently organized around use, but do we want to look at an option to organize them around the height of buildings? Do we want to talk about the transect model that Grant brought up? And those kinds of things. We have some ideas and we'll bring something for you to react to. So our goal in these meetings isn't to provide an empty sheet of paper, but it's to have something to react to. And so what we're anticipating bringing is, here's an option for these new zones, and here's what the intent statement is. So the intent statement will be grounded in the comp plan. But then once we come to an agreement on the types of zones and the intent statements, we can start then filling out the details of the requirements that fall underneath those. And so, for example, if we combine a couple of zoning districts into this one neighborhood district, then we can start, and we have an intent statement about what we want to achieve, then we can start filling in the details at future meetings. And so getting that foundational piece will be super important up front. So that's what we would anticipate. And after that, it would be some tables with some photos and some other, as many visuals as we can do. And we'll just figure it out as we go through, but we're lucky to have a deep bench of consultants to be helping us with this. So thanks so much.
Are you providing that information prior to the meeting?
Yeah, well, we look to provide packets at least 2 weeks ahead of time. So we want at least a couple of weekends, not that you have to look at it over the weekend. And we'll give as much advance notice about meetings as possible. So we just want to make sure we'll have the information available before we do it. It's unlikely to be May, but it would probably be the following month, I guess.
But we do intend to use the planning commission cadence, so it'll always be a second or fourth Wednesday of the month.
Second Wednesday, is the one we're doing, yeah. So second Wednesday at 6 p.m. if 6 p.m. works. Also, in this conversation, I realize there's probably some unanswered questions. There comes a point in the process where like we only have a couple hours here and you want us to set up some virtual office hours. So on lunch break, you can log in and just ping for some questions. We're happy to do that too, so.
All right, any other comments, questions? Like to make a motion, do I need to make a motion?
No.
To adjourn? All right. I'm gonna go ahead and adjourn the meeting.
You can have the gavel.
Thank you so much. And I can't wait to be there in person to meet all of you. So thanks so much for your time. And I'm very impressed by your expertise. So thank you.
Give me those. Oh, you have that too? I just